the soil carbon sponge is I think the most beautiful visual that really unifies these topics of climate and permaculture. It brings together so much. So I really want to just pause on this piece of artwork for a moment, because, you know, 20 years ago when I was studying permaculture with Bill Mollison, I did a pretty big pivot. It took over my life. My family thought I joined a cult because I was so passionate about it. And I think one of the reasons it really captured me was the community of people around it. It wasn't just the teachers. It's to me, and it is a philosophy and it is a methodology, but to me the most important thing is that it is what I would call trans-indigenous land and water management. And I don't think Bill Mollison ever made any claim that it was his work. He just, the entire course, he just told stories of living with indigenous people and how they and create a culture around that. And so, it was the funniest thing about Bill is that he was I think he kind of had a love-hate with California because it's so, quote, in his words, woo-woo here. And people were talking a lot about Zone Zero, which is like the inner work. And he hated that. He was just like, let's just talk about the soil and the wind and the water. But for my lens, for the most of human evolution, we were prey, right? So this is kind of our relationship to nature is deep ancestral trauma. And I think it helps us understand why we've degraded and paved the planet to the point where our very own thriving and survival is threatened. And so to me, I love this phrase of nature-based solutions. And like you look at the United Nations level work of, international NGOs, and nature-based solutions to climate change it's pretty hot right now. And it's really good. It's where we need to go, which is the decade of ecosystem restoration, as the United Nations has declared. But to me, underneath that is what I would call economic rewilding. And that means, that the healers of the land and the water and the healers and the space holders for human communities to transition our economy, they're equally important. We cannot limit our view on this topic. We have to really be so still that we can create a new epigenome, and that integrates this ancestral healing, and indubitably the healing between indigenous people and the rest of us, which I would call refugees. We're all just indigenous people that, for whatever reason, and we were pawns by the kings and the divine right of capital and etc. The shifting baseline syndrome, I think, is the most important syndrome to recognize. I think the younger generations that did not witness the abundance of nature, they just, their worldview is that's the base, that scarcity is the baseline. And that's that's where the storytellers, especially, yeah, I think the visual arts, but the oral traditions, indigenous and National Geographic, I think it's so important that we really address this issue, because yeah, I mean, our oceans and indeed our this is this sort of simplification and degradation, it is an epidemic. It is a plague, it is a blight. And I call this ecosystem management by bookkeepers, because the accountants are really just trying to squeeze out the maximum profit in the shortest amount of time for their shareholders, and making that short-term profit pencil out. And this is the effect it has, right? So how do we start to reverse this bad land management into ecosystem restoration? And so, here you have the Society for Conservation Biology, that Society for Ecological Restoration. You have all of these professional associations working on this, and they, I would say, are mostly coming out of academia, right? They're not necessarily hands in the earth people. And so there's a real cognitive dissonance between what our sort of money holders, philanthropists, and, even environmental NGOs and academic professionals are saying, and they so clearly see what needs to happen, and how to hold the human community that could and I think should be implementing this restoration. And so what we end up with is technical scientists illiterate in what we call social permaculture. And because they're illiterate, they turn to pesticides and herbicides and are applying these poisons across vast landscapes of forests and farmland, huge swaths of the landscape. And it's I don't think it's the right path. So moving into the soil carbon sponge, I would say the two icons of my personal cosmology are Lynn Margulis, the soil microbiologist that developed symbiogenesis theory and Gaia hypothesis with James Lovelock, and Elaine Ingham, who is a soil microbiologist that is creating a popular education curriculum around the biology of the soil food web. And in it's so sacred and precious, this understanding of the soil. And I'm not going to go deep into it, but it's a whole new language but the nutshell is that the soil carbon sponge is made of dead and living microbes and their exudates. And the silt, clay, and sand is just the substrate, and alone they are inert, they are not living. In fact, most degraded lands and the so-called moonscapes of a post-catastrophic wildfire they've had the soil food web obliterated. And so learning how to exponentialize and rapidly create a hyper evolution of soil food web succession, I think, is really the magic sauce of all of this. And shout out to Matt Powers right now too. I think he's on fire around all of this. I can't stop listening to him. So in the permaculture lexicon, what we're really looking at is zone 5. If we're talking about reversing the loss of rainfall or restoring the small water cycle and local rainfall patterns that we've lost across huge swaths of the planet through millennia of civilizational soil degradation, then we're looking at the aggregation of our zone 5 permaculture. So like if you're not literate in permaculture, the zone 1 is like your house, and it scales out to zone 2, 3, 4, and 5 to from more to less frequented parts of the landscape. And so zone 1 is where you're doing intensive food production. And then zone 5 is classically called unmanaged, but I would say that really what we're looking at is how do we manage a severely degraded zone 5 across continents. And that this idea of building, of using our fuel ladder, create coarse woody debris. Coarse woody debris is an extraordinarily important phrase from ecology that is about building coarseness into the landscape, right? Because there's like holes and pockets and heterogeneity that is where the food web starts to find habitat and wet pockets and different kinds of plants growing, and it's the physical armature of biodiversity, I would say, is this coarseness in the landscape. And it's the inverse of what our sort of aesthetic proclivities have created, whereby we just grade, we flatten any kind of heterogeneity, and yeah, and it's a pretty catastrophic way of thinking. There's a saying that a tree gives more in death than it does in life, right? So, you know, here in California, and I think in many places in the world, what we're seeing is the increase of this flood, fire, drought cycle. And the institutional response is like, well, wood burns, so let's take out the wood and we won't have wildfire or catastrophic wildfire. I mean, it's a bit of a simplification, but it's kind of what's happening. And it's the opposite of what needs to happen. You know, I am a subscriber of Pleistocene rewilding. If we look at the megafauna of the Pleistocene, you would see elephants and mastodons and mammoths tipping over trees and crushing the fuel ladder into the soil, building that soil carbon sponge structurally. And we have to mimic that. I think we're since the 80 to 90% of megafauna that died off contemporaneous with human hunting I think the onus of moral responsibility is to mimic the Pleistocene megafauna's impact on the landscape, which looks really messy, but there's no, it's really a war of art. We have to combat this sort of French landscape, lawn and shrubbery aesthetic that has been associated with high class living, and flip it on its ass. So the taboo around sanitation is really deep, right? We've had, epidemics that have killed off half of humanity across the planet. Yet we have to get over it. The excrement, the soil carbon sponge that is built by the fecal deposition of the entire food web is unbelievably large and unquantified. Mark has talked about, being interested in quantification, and every scientist I talk to, no one is quantifying what is quite possibly the single largest key to rebuilding the global soil carbon sponge, which is poo. And it's just a taboo. And that's why we're so deeply blinded. Oh, and if you're feeding any dewormers to your livestock, it's game over. This whole food web dies. So dewormers not allowed. Try herbal veterinary care or holistic veterinary care. It works. So here in the United States, the Bison Nation, Buffalo Nation was wiped out intentionally to destroy the economy and the food web of the Plains Indians that were, by many perspectives, the most fierce warriors on the continent. And there were millions of buffalo, and that this Buffalo Nation rising needs really to come back, and it is coming back. Along the West Coast, we had millions of elk and deer and antelope, and camels evolved first in North America and then crossed over to Eurasia, and then went extinct in North America. So I think when you're looking at the higher up fuel ladder, like thinking about like how giraffes browse, I would be looking at Pleistocene camelids in the landscape, and not chainsaws. Ghosts of evolution for a really fascinating in-depth perspective on that. So while large ungulates are a key strategy in rebuilding the soil carbon sponge, I think we have to be really real about what grazing in the West has perpetrated, which is one of the greatest degradations, not only in here on the West Coast, but I would say civilizationally. We have lost the ecosystem benefits by set stock grazing, which just means you just let your livestock graze a plot of land indefinitely. There's no rotation, there's no mimicking what a large predator relationship would have by moving that herd around. Like the wolves of Yellowstone, I think, are a popular example if anyone wants to YouTube that and learn more. But basically, yeah, by just completely grazing all of this root mass, and it's argued, but by some estimates, grasslands sequester far more carbon than forests. So I know we're all tree huggers, but where are my grass huggers? So death is another taboo. I mean, if you think about the biomass and the cycling of our dead bodies and all of the dead bodies of all life, I would say it's second to poop as a builder of the soil carbon sponge. And yet the taboo, it's largely unquantified. The taboo around it is astronomical. So yeah, we really, if you look at the aggregated effects of the tremendous biodiversity loss, and that all of that decomposition becoming atmospheric instead of soil-borne carbon, then you were looking at a real tragedy here. So this is a work of a Japanese ecologist named Miyawaki. It's very kindred to permaculture, very kindred to syntropic forestry coming out of Brazil. There's a lot of parallel movements that are really beautiful and wonderful. And to me, permaculture is just a meeting place for these parallel movements to be discussed and to be shared and exchanged. But I think this is a good example of how conservation it has kind of narrow myopic scope, and traditional restoration, because what permaculture is good at is accelerating evolution and getting us from severely degraded states to very robust food webs and a building of the soil carbon sponge in a short time. I've taught tree planting and worked as a tree planter, and most tree planting, which is, I would say, the most iconic ritual around restoration. They're just people like digging a hole in degraded land and then putting a tree in it, and by most measurements, and again, if we want to talk about what we're measuring, I think we have to really measure the success rate of all of the carbon credited tree plantings and so forth, and that are just kind of doing ribbon cuttings, and that those trees will live, but they're not
making forest.
Yeah, they're not carbon multipliers, right? That's what permaculture is good at. They're not integrating carbon cascades. That's what permaculture is good at. And here, this mature, quasi-climax forest, it could be a completely native food forest, right? It could be an oak savanna with, here in the West, it could have elderberry and hazel and amelanchier and gooseberry and currant and raspberry and native blackberry, and it can go on and on with native food that could be so high yielding and so abundant. But we could start out densely planting non-natives that we then, in a series of severe prunings, we cut down and let them create the nurse tree, because that same small water cycle that can restore the rain pattern at a bioregional scale can restore the rain pattern or the humidity pattern that a nurse tree provides to a very young planting in a severely degraded landscape. So the ideas are very scalable. They're very fractal. So Alpha talked a lot about this idea of effective versus non-effective rainfall, and how on the left you see, without a soil carbon sponge or runoff or degraded compacted soils, you're getting, and this is so common, like 90% of the landscapes I feel like I see that have any human management, 90% of the water is either running off anthropogenically or evapotranspiring anthropogenically. In pristine primal ecosystems, you're getting closer to 100% of infiltration and absorption by the soil carbon sponge. And that's what we're going for. So I love this graphic that really kind of ties all that drought, flood, fire cycle together, because as you're drying out the groundwater, the plants are responding and they're holding that much less water in their tissue. And then they're much more flammable. And when there's ample groundwater, the plants themselves are full of water, and then a catastrophic or a crown fire that obliterates an ecosystem turns into a ground fire, or what the Karuk and Hupa and Yurok tribes that I studied with called good fire, right? So bioprecipitation, important to understand that the seeds of rain are coming from what is generically called dust. But if you look at some more nuanced perspectives, there have been documented studies of forests in times of drought increasing I believe they're called terpenes. Like pine forests are famous for this, that smell of pine that you smell in a pine forest. They actually release an increased amount of these terpenes that are also the seeds for ice nucleation and precipitation, right? So it's not just H2O, but it's the seed upon which H2O condenses. And microbes, spores, pollen, all of that. I'm really loving the work Alpha talked about. Milan, the Spanish scientist that has really created a beautiful narrative. Check out Alpha's podcast with Milan too. Alpha's been capturing some great interviews recently. This graphic by the Weathermakers out of the Netherlands, which was inspired by Tim Flannery's book called The Weathermakers. They're really looking at this continental basin scale restoration of lost rainfall. And I think in this, especially in the Sinai Peninsula, where some of the earliest human civilizations began to degrade landscapes. And yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, hot land that has absorbed more heat because there's no shade or soil carbon sponge to keep the land cool and moist. It increases wind patterns, right? So you get this increase in extreme weather and typhoons and hurricanes because these kind of thermal updrafts are moving up the mountain with that, being pushed by that hot air rising faster and faster. Whereas in a cool, damp forest, everything's just moving slowly. And that's climatically, that's what we're going for. And yeah, Alpha showed this slide, but it's so worth looking at again. I mean, I think, again, talking about quantifiable data, I think this data set is staring us all smack in the face. Yeah, no one's taking it seriously, right? Like no policymakers or funders, like everyone, they are, but it's kind of like it's not in the popular reality. It's such a basic truth that why are we still farming the way we're farming and foresting and ranching and building cities? It's all very backwards. We should be building cities based on this right side and managing landscapes. So here you can see the Sinai Peninsula and this is a model of how if the small water cycle was restored at scale, you begin to see how the rain is restored, and then you get this carbon cascade and exponential carbon and the return of local rainfall and resilience and food security and all the good things. So tying it back to we the humans, and here in the West, I find it kind of hilarious and kind of beautiful that we have this movement of fitness fanatics that are practicing a philosophy called move nat or move naturally. And the idea is that sort of repetitive exercise that we find in gyms and weightlifting is not how we optimize our fitness. It's through heterogeneous movement, right? So basically permaculture, but these people are going to these outdoor gyms and paying instructors to teach them how to lift heavy things and move things around in order to become more fit. So it's like there's this massive trend already coming from humans, but there's no receiving body to be like, well, let's take this massive trend and restore the planet, right? So there's another big cognitive dissonance there.
Human.
Yes. So this is a really cool map of all the continents and their basins, right? So these are the gray areas are either landlocked, they don't have a natural outlet to the sea, or their mountains. And that's where the basins, kind of like creeks and rivers, flow into contiguous basins. The atmospheric rivers do the same thing, right? I mean, some of them obviously go far above, but the local water cycle happens within these basins as a general pattern. And so this is kind of when we start to map the ecosystem restoration camps that are sprouting up across the planet. Shout out to the work of John Liu, a filmmaker who documented the largest ecosystem restoration ever attempted in the Los Plateau of China. I think, I think we can start to really aggregate our zone 5s around these ecosystem restoration camps that have an internal permaculture economy to feed themselves, but have an external economy in restoring wildlife corridors and continental scale ecosystem function. And so, anyone can travel the world now and do ecosystem restoration and have all their basic needs met, and start their own camp, and start to implement this work as part of the movement. And lastly, a shout out to Skeeter, Michael Pilarski, who's been doing this work for decades and has recently announced the Global Earth Repair Summit from October 21st to 24th. So I hope all of you with your various projects can host an event as part of this network and get inspired by each other as we're doing the work. So thanks a lot. And that will conclude my presentation.
Thanks, everyone. I have about a 5-minute window here to just throw some content at you, and I'll do my best to be succinct. There's a lot I want to say. I think that what we're really looking at is there's plenty of educational foundation now for understanding the small water cycle and what kinds of agroforestry systems we need to create, what kind of appropriate technologies we need to use, what kinds of groups we need to influence to move into a more climate resilient future. But the challenge that I see is that there's just not a lot of pathways that take us to careers in climate resilient permaculture design. So how do we create jobs? How do we fund organizations and fund individuals to actually get through a sophisticated level of education that they can be useful in the design world? You know, when you go through the permaculture design course, it's great. It's a really mind, soul, heart-opening experience, but it doesn't actually give you any skills to move forward. It just lets you know there's a little sampling of all the things that are out there that you can choose to focus on. So what would it look like to have a year-long or a 2-year-long master's in permaculture design that focused on climate resiliency? Like how would we fund that? How would we get people skilled up enough to be able to hold their own in these new climate resilient designs that we need? And how do we infiltrate them into the organizations that are actually moving forward with funded positions in these types of much needed careers? What we're also finding, as much as there's some really horrible elections going on in our country, there's also a lot of people that are getting elected on a sustainability mandate, but they really have no roadmap to implement what they get elected on. And so how do we offer workshops and trainings for them to, one, connect with already existing groups that are working on these solutions, but two, that they understand that to implement sustainability at an urban level or a city level or a county level or a state level, we just don't have the people power to do it. Like, we have the core foundational, you know, the graphics that you guys showed, the information that we look at, we can learn that, but it's only the cutting edge of what it means to design, implement it, troubleshoot it, have a career in it, look at the accelerated succession of that system over time in a changing time, right? So the climate change reality, like one of the colleagues I'm working with now, we talk a lot about the fact that almost nobody is designing for what the weather's going to be in 10 years. So we can look at our climate equation for right now and say, oh, let's plant more avocado trees on Maui. But really, if avocados aren't going to survive if it's 10 degrees hotter, we need to be putting a percentage of our projects into experimental crops that are going to be anticipating what's going to be happening in that area in the future. I think that there's a huge demand for talent all throughout the hiring equations right now. Having just spent time in Europe, as I said, there's money in the pipeline right now to hire people into careers who are skilled in these systems, but there just aren't enough people. So the systems that I'm looking at, so there's agroforestry, which is, climate resilient agroforestry. For me, that's my passion, but there's also urban permaculture. There's all kinds of policy work that we need to influence, all the appropriate technologies. And then of course, there's the field work. How do we identify and showcase and apprentice people into organizations and meeting people that are already doing the work and learning for them in the field? It's not enough to just be book learned and then go on to the next part. So I just want to presence that, is that we really need to take a subset of our permaculture organization and offer some real education at the next more profound level of understanding of climate change. Because permaculture is not just one thing. I mean, there's like many branches of permaculture. There's, there's energy, there's water, there's waste, there's food, there's social permaculture, that, like all of the branches of permaculture make up the design methodology, right? So the whole point is, how do we live large on a small footprint instead of living huge on a huge footprint? I mean, it's ridiculous what humans are doing now. So getting that next level of education founded, I find, is really important. So I monitor things like the Asian Development Bank website and the job offerings, and the African Development Bank job offerings, and the different groups that are hiring people into potential careers for my students. And the number of climate change jobs is just going through the roof. But I really don't feel that there's enough opportunity for people to get qualified to even have those jobs. So there's a few universities, like there's the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. They have a 1 and 2 year master's programs in climate change. They are doing a lot of scientific stuff, glaciology, those kinds of things. And they're doing a lot of the monitoring, and they're the computer programming for that. And they have a wide array of choices there. Slow Food University in Italy has gone from gastronomy to food sovereignty to taking local food into the climate resilient design end. So they're changing the trajectory of their graduate studies and undergraduate studies. And there's a few more universities now that are starting to offer some climate resilient climate change programming. But where's us? Where's the permaculture experts also as part of these curriculums? So that's just what I wanted to talk about. And when we go into the breakout rooms, anybody who wants to continue that conversation can join me there.
Thank you, Jenny. You got an invitation to do a 60-minute talk on that.
Okay.
Check the chat.
All right.
Okay, so Alpha, do you think we have time for breakouts, or should we just have a...
Let's just open up for questions. Let's see what's the field wanting. So yeah, any questions about any of the 3 talks or comments from anyone?
So I have lots of questions, but I'll start with one. So for people who live in a wildland urban interface in a fire zone, what advice do you give for managing around their homes in a way that is protective for wildfire, but also working toward restoring the land. So I know like where we are and where we want to be, which is, you know, a surrounding forest that is resilient and has more moisture and is more resilient to wildfire. But given where we are right now, I mean, we want to leave deadwood, we want to leave mulch and, you know, leaves and all of that. But we're also told that that's a huge fire risk to have around your home, that you need to clear for, you know, 100 feet around your house and have bare dirt. So where's the right balance?
Where are you based?
I'm in Los Angeles in the hills.
Oh, you said San Bernardino Hills?
San Fernando Valley, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Nick, you're about to talk? You have some comments too?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, to me, the oak savanna, what it is and was the permaculture of California for thousands of years, for most of California. And most of the indigenous people that I've worked with in California, they're burning conifer forests because conifers reduce the biodiversity in an oak forest. They outshade the oaks. So I would be mimicking an oak savanna, which means you can have a lot of defensible space and a lot of low growing, wet, non-flammable planting without having a lot of flammable fuel ladder around your house. So to me, it's more within the nuance, you know. In a wildfire that's really hot, when it hits a wet forest, it's going to soften and calm down. Of course, if you're surrounded by people that are just suffering degraded dry land and planting trees that are dry, then it's kind of tough. You know, you kind of got to work as a community, as a forest, or as an oak savanna together in order to not be so vulnerable.
Jenny.
Yeah, so there's several levels that I would look at that from. One is looking ahead. What's it going to be like in 5 and 10 and 20 years there? Is it going to be more sere, more dry, more pulses and extremes, right? So that's probably where it's headed. And so on the policy level, I would be, if I were benevolent queen, like if it were me making these decisions, I would mandate gray water, right? So every single drop of water that comes out of your laundry and your sink and your shower should be going into fire resilient breaks using plants that are fire resilient. And then of course you need to have like the fire practical stuff of, having fire breaks that are wide enough that the trucks can get through, right? And then you have to understand the wind patterns. Like, so all the pattern literacy that comes with understanding what to do in your area should be being done on a policy level. You've got both the Santa Ana winds that periodically come down off the hills that are deadly, in the extreme deadly. And then you have the other, the other winds and the other fire systems that are there, right? So is Los Angeles looking at large scale swales across the foothills of the, right, of the basin? Are they understanding the bigger equations there? Or are they stuck in a policy gap where they really don't know how to, they don't deer in the headlights, right? Where's the funds being allocated to that? And so when you look at those fire resilient shrubs that don't necessarily just explode in fire, right? You're looking at stuff that's also going to stack functions by creating habitat for the right kinds of birds that are going to eat the seed and that they're going to plant it out to the next areas, right? So you have a micro level, just your own house, you have your neighborhood, you have your community, and then you have your watershed. Like you're looking at these, different scales of design, right? But if you have a fabulous micro scale design and then all around you, everything is going to go up in flames, it's kind of useless, right? So the question back at you is, at what level are you willing to engage with pattern literacy within your own community? And, if you convened a community meeting on being climate resilient and fire resilient, would people show up? Likely. Would you be able to bring in an expert that you agree with, who's going to help people understand that? So the average American uses between 50 and 75 gallons of water per person per day. And so if you look at that multiplied by the amount of people in your neighborhood, that's a huge amount of water resource that you're just pissing away. You're just throwing it away every time you flush the toilet. So how can you take that water resource and turn it into fire resilient plantings that are going to cool your landscape? And Brad Lancaster is probably the best resource for that.
Cool, thanks. And I'll just throw in too that San Fernando, there's a San Fernando Valley. So there's a whole mountain range there. And so a lot of that water is raining onto the land, into the mountains, and then draining out into the storm drain. So if you can capture that with these terraces, swales, and check dams on your property, rear and drain rocks or whatever. And also there's a lot of big parks near Mulholland Drive there that can also, capture a lot of this rain. So I think there is a lot of work that can be done in that area, and maybe creating a watershed council in your area.
Yes, we're doing all that. So part of what my group is advocating for is, nature-based solutions for the LA River and the Sepulveda Basin, trying to, deconcrete sections of the river and expand the floodplain out so that, people aren't going to die when the flood comes, all of that. And we hold community meetings once a month as we host experts on all aspects of climate change and climate related issues. But yes, so we do have an active community working on this at the policy level in Los Angeles, but we also try to provide advice and information for, individuals that individuals can act on in their own space. We do a balance of advocating for policy issues at the higher levels, both, locally in Los Angeles and statewide, and trying to find ways for individuals to act in their backyards to make these sorts of improvements.